Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, a great city is one that attracts people and investment. That's what builds the economy. That's what builds culture, educational institutions, and ideas, innovations that are essential to the prosperity, to the sustainability, and to the livability of our urban areas. This panel, our opening panel, is, as you can see already, peopled by people who know what they're talking about on this matter. So allow me to introduce them. First of all, Seth Pinsky. Seth Pinsky is the president of New York City's Economic Development Corporation. His goal is to make the Big Apple the world's center for innovation. Gordon Campbell. Indeed. Hi, Gordon. Canada's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. He was Mayor of Vancouver, of course. He was Premier of British Columbia. And if you like Vancouver, you'll like him, because he did a lot to build it. Jorn Weisbrodt is the Artistic Director of Luminato, one of Toronto's great cultural events, a man who could put an opera on at La Scala or a festival in Berlin. And he knows what culture does for a city. And Sandra Pupatello, the Director of Business Development and Global Markets for PricewaterhouseCoopers. She's a former Provincial Minister of Economic Development. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel, and it's a pleasure to see them all. And our Ilsa will be our chair for this session. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, David, and welcome to our panelists. Certainly, I know I have a million questions, and we want to leave some time at the end for the audience as well. So let me start with a very simple challenge we all have, is that the stuff that makes our cities innovative, ideas, talent, money, are all highly mobile commodities. How do we create stickiness in our cities so that those assets will stay around for a while? And maybe, Seth, you're in perhaps the most mobile of cities. What's New York's secret sauce for getting them there and keeping them there?
Well, Mayor Bloomberg, since he came into office in 2010, has believed that there are really three key ingredients to making a city competitive in the 21st century. The first of those ingredients is infrastructure. New York City learned a very difficult lesson in the 1970s, 1980s, when it went through challenging fiscal times, and the way that it balanced its budget was by cutting its investment in new infrastructure and stopping investment in existing infrastructure. And that really turned out to be a disaster that cost us billions of dollars and decades to dig our way out of. And so even in the face of that, of the difficult fiscal environment that we're now working in the 21st century, the mayor has continued to invest at near record rates. Our latest capital budget for the city is nearly $40 billion over the next 5 years. So that's, I think, one critical element. You have to be able to move people, move goods, not just around a city, but into and out of a city. I think the second piece is a regulatory piece. And some may find that ironic for us to say in New York, because New York, I think, has a reputation as a place that is a high tax environment, and it certainly is not an inexpensive place in which to do business. But I think that a balance between smart regulation, certainly not an unregulated system, but smart regulation, and the ability to collect revenues to make the investments that are necessary to keep a city safe and clean and desirable. That all is a second element. And then the third element, which I think many people don't think of as a piece of economic development, but Mayor Bloomberg has really been clear from the very beginning he views as the critical element, is quality of life. Because in the 21st century, what makes a city competitive at its most basic element is having talented people. And if you have talented people, business will follow. So when we invest in keeping our streets safer, when we invest in building parks, cultural institutions, improving our schools, all of that is being done not just because it's the right thing to do when you're running a city, but also because it's a key to our economic success in the century to come.
Any other comments on that question? Otherwise, I would go.
Well, I think that's all correct. but I think that the most important thing in any city to be a great city is people. New York would not be a great city if people hadn't come to New York from all over the world and gathered there and had to create a critical mass of activity that was taking place. So cities are, for me at least, are places where there is trade, there is exchange in ideas, there is economic, and I don't think it's chaos, but there certainly is, there's action taking place that you can't predict, and and frankly, you can't plan it. But you have to sort of have the people first, you have to have a vision of where you're going, and then you have to commit to the vision. So it's easy to say all the words. It's much tougher to take the actual actions that reflect those words and make the cities livable places where people want to be, where exchanges take place. There's a woman named Bonnie Menes-Kahn who wrote a book called Cosmopolitan Culture. And one of the things that she points out in that book is how some cities are very open to people. They're open to strangers. They're welcoming. And that creates an incredible kind of dynamism in the city. And then there's some cities that are actually, there may be good cities, but they're not international cities. They sort of hold you back a little bit. We're from here and you're not kind of cities. I think when a city is welcoming and open, I think there's an opportunity to create the kind of stickiness that you're talking about that really creates its own critical mass that drives activity, that drives, I think, enthusiasm and creativity. And culture, commerce, the exchange of ideas, I think, is what really makes great cities. People know where those things are happening, and that's where they want to go.
So let's stick with that theme, and since we have two public servants with extraordinary track records in public service, let me ask you this question. How do cities get in their own way? It seems to me that a lot of the elements of the Innovation City, we know what to do. We've talked about many of these elements for decades, in fact. But we can't quite get to action. The innovation piece is sort of our unfinished business. Sandra, how do we get in our own way as cities?
Such a big question. First of all, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to speak about it, and especially in the context of Toronto, which is one of the world's great cities. I actually think that Seth may have touched on that when he spoke about regulation. In an odd way, and different worlds will have different levels of who controls or owns the regulation that ultimately impacts so greatly on cities. But where innovation is concerned, it's multi-governmental and it's about process. And I think that the one stumbling block that political leadership hasn't figured out is turning it upside down and saying, okay, so from the user's perspective, how are we making it impossible for innovation to flourish? And the little bit of experience I'd had with the Ontario government in it called Open for Business Initiative, where we did exactly that. We grabbed the industry, we put them across from us, we put multi-ministries across from them, all in the same room, all at the same time, which had never happened before. And then we started to tell stories about the ridiculousness of what we've done because of our process. And if there's one way to, throw cold water on young people and exuberance, that's how to do it. It's with process. You just kill them with it. And I think we have to take responsibility for that and fix it. So if I was sort of dreaming in a dream world, I would have a department reporting directly to the mayor or directly to the CEO of a city who's solely responsible for process. And you can call it red tape if you want to be political about it, or wherever you are on the spectrum, it really doesn't matter, because ultimately the process is our undoing. To be fair, so then you start embedding all of these things in a tendering process, which knocks out all the beginners who you want to move to the next step, because we have to be fair and accountable for every step. Not to say you shouldn't be, but that very thing, if you don't do it well, will actually eliminate 3/4 of these people with all the energy in the world that want to go to that next level. So I do think process is our biggest stumbling block.
Well, and I would just build on that. I think that what's tricky about cities at any point in history, but especially today, given that the environment is so competitive, is that it really has to be finely calibrated, and that calibration has to be dynamic. In other words, it's very easy. I mean, if you take the 3 axes that I mentioned, or any other set of axes, you have to get it right. And if you do too much on one end or too much on the other, you can really stifle innovation. If you invest too little in infrastructure, for example, the results of that are obvious. But there are also problems if you invest too much in infrastructure, if you squander resources, if you borrow too much and put burdens that are too heavy on future generations. Regulation is certainly another way. You can over-regulate, but you can also under-regulate. We've seen the examples and the damage that that's done. I think getting it right and then also understanding that over time, the balance changes. What makes sense in one period of time may not make sense in another. The needs of the economy, the needs of cities are constantly changing. And if cities get too stuck in their ways, if they think that they've found the magic formula and aren't willing to make changes over time, I think they run into real problems.
Gordon, what would you say? How do we get in our way?
Well, can I ask the audience something? How many of you are actually involved in cities right now as an architect, as a planner, as a city person, whatever? Any of you do that?
Lots.
Of those guys that are putting up your hands, do any of you think that there's anything in your processes that get in the way of doing what you would like to do? Because I think that's, I think actually it's a fundamental question for us. We can talk about a catalytic city, we can talk about an innovative city, and that's great. Wouldn't we all love to be innovative cities? Now I'll ask everybody at this room to tell me at their table how they define innovative city. What is it we mean we're going to do that? What are we going to do when we actually say that? There are dozens of things that we know in our public world, and this is a public world issue. It's an issue for the United States, it's an issue for Canada, it's an issue for lots of places in Western Europe. What is it we know that we should be doing that somehow or other we just haven't found the link to make it happen? Why is it that we constantly resist that? And I think one of the challenges that we have, particularly in North America, is we're comfortable. So we don't like to talk about a new vision. We don't use glasses that look to the future. We use the glasses that reflect the past. Marshall McLuhan, I think, said we had a 10-year rearview mirror we worked in. Because the world has changed so fast, I think that mirror is now about 25 years, 25 years back. And I hear discussions today about the world from before, and the world has changed dramatically in the last 10 years, let alone 25 years. So our institutions, we have this status quo is the most powerful force that you are up against in sort of delivering a vision. And institutional inertia is one of the things that locks us in to the status quo. So we have to find a way that we have public discussions that move to action, not to wouldn't it be nice stuff, but what are we going to do stuff. And I would suggest to cities, I think, Seth, what you've been doing in New York is, that's great, now we're going to get on and do some of this stuff, because if we don't do this stuff, the deficit that you were talking about before gets deeper and deeper and deeper, whether it's infrastructure deficit or trade deficit or whatever it is. So I think intellectually we have to sort of move from the talk part of life to the action part of life and say, what are we actually going to do? And that's why you need the vision, because if you don't know where you're going, it's pretty hard to get there. And there's got to be some common public discussion about vision. Let me just tell you one quick Vancouver story. I was mayor of Vancouver at the end of the 1980s. There's a lot of people coming into Vancouver at the end of the 1980s. And there was a description of it as Hongcouver, the Asian invasion, those sorts of discussions were taking place. And so what we did was we organized a group of what we called city dialogues. There's only one deal in the city dialogues. People who actually had some facts would come to the public, make a public presentation, and then everyone could say whatever they thought as long as they were dealing with the facts, and no one could call anyone names when they disagreed with what they said, which is a very important part of this, because people used to say, I don't want you to call me a name, but I think this, this, and this. So we got rid of that. And literally the discussion and putting the facts out to people and what they wanted the city to look like changed the public discussion completely. Almost from the time of the first dialogue on, the public discussion started to change. So we have to find a way that we're having these discussions about what we really want to be. What do we mean by innovative? What do we mean by catalytic? What do we mean by economic health in a city? What takes place? And it's not going to be, my bet is in Toronto, you're not going to have the same economic strategy that you had 50 years ago. You're certainly not in New York. And we're certainly not, I think, in most of the major cities of the world. They're looking at how do they move forward as opposed to how they move back. But the status quo and institutional inertia holds us back. So we have to find a way that we articulate the vision and drive to the vision. And sometimes you get hurt, being quotes hurt, driving to the vision. Someone's always going to disagree with the vision. One person once said to me, Gord, I don't think I can vote for you. I don't agree with everything you did. And I said, you know, I've been doing this for a long time. I don't agree with everything I did. So, I mean, we all have to be at least willing to accept that.
So I can't resist, with this treasure trove of international arts experience, to throw the question of, talk to us about the role of big arts events, institutions in the innovative city. And what do they bring uniquely to a city? Why did you come to Luminato in Toronto when we have so many choices? Why does it matter to the city and much broader to Canada to have a Luminato in Toronto?
Maybe before sort of going to that question, I want to latch on a little bit to what's been said before, and I think, you know, what makes a great city, or what are also the obstacles that cities have. And obviously I'm an arts person, and I believe sort of in the driving force of the arts and everything sort of. I mean, we are in an extremely visual age, and the visual arts are extremely important in creating images and creating sort of ideas for the future. And I think the most important asset really for artists, and the reason why artists come to a city and what makes cities great, is basically space. They need cheap space. I mean, that's why Paris was so successful in the late 19th century, because there was just a lot of space that was open for occupation. That's why New York sort of attracted so many great artists in the 60s, because they passed a law that you can basically occupy empty loft spaces in Lower Manhattan without being evicted. That's why Berlin is so great in the 21st century, because A, it was a divided city, and then when it came back together, there was just so much space and so much cheap space for people to do things. So I think in a way, I mean, innovation, you can always think about what drives innovation, but sometimes the absence of a plan is actually much more, it is much more effective, and just offering, I mean, it really is simple. Artists need space, and it is as simple as that, and they like to occupy space and invade space, sort of. And then on the other side of this...
Invade.
Yeah.
Good
I mean,
word.
that's what it was in Manhattan. And I mean, I think that's what is sad about New York at the moment. Can't used to be the center of the art world. Now it's the center of the art market, because most of the artists are basically gone. They can't afford to live there anymore. They can't afford, I mean, yes, Jeff Koons, of course, can, and but they can't produce there anymore. A lot of these people are now in Berlin, so Berlin is really much more the center of the art world. I mean, I was just at the Documenta in Kassel, and you go, you know, you look at all these artists, and like 30% of them, they, you know, were born here and they were born there or whatever, and they live and work in Berlin. That's sort of the standard, you know, sentence now. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, on the other side, you know, you do have these great cultural institutions, and I think a festival, I think sort of the greatness of a cultural nation really depends on two things. It depends on, A, can you produce great artists and support them? Does that meaning, do you have enough platforms that you can give to an artist? Do you have enough institutions that you can, where you can actually support their work? And it's not necessarily only just by giving them money, but by giving them the abilities to create work and to show their work. And B, and almost more importantly, can you attract great artists to live and work in your country or in your city? And that's why, you know, again, Berlin, Paris, New York, or whatever, historically were so great. I think that's why Detroit is actually going to be great. I mean, I know so many people these days, so many artists, young artists these days, that say, I'm going to move to Detroit, because there is a lot of abandoned space there that they can use for, you know, for their projects. So watch out for Detroit.
Detroit's still great.
You have these sort of large institutions, and I think a festival like Luminato is sort of the possibility of offering a temporary home to an international community of artists. And I think it's very important also that artists, to me, artists don't really have a nationality. They don't belong to a certain country. They belong to all of us. The great arts belong to all of us. I mean, it doesn't matter if you know, the Mona Lisa was painted by an Italian. It's a work of art that belongs to humanity and not to a certain country. And Jesse Norman sang at the bicentennial of the French Revolution in Paris, the national anthem. I mean, an American singer singing sort of at the most holy day for the French. You know, I think that is an important aspect to be open, and I think a festival like Luminato can create this sort of temporary home and can be a place where artists meet from all over the world, from all over Canada, to create something new and to think about, you know, something new.
Can I just jump in on one point that you made about New York?
I love New York.
Yeah.
It's definitely on my top 5 list. So
That's good. No,
I still have an apartment there, but
no, I think you raise.
I've lived there for a long time.
No, you raise actually, I think, a very important point, which is that a lot of artists, a lot of young creative people have in fact been priced out of Manhattan.
Yeah, I know. You're talking about Brooklyn now, of course.
Yeah, and I think actually though that goes back to your point about space. There were two trends which converged at a very important time in New York City's history at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, which was the boom in real estate in Manhattan and the fact that many people were being priced out of neighborhoods that had traditionally attracted the creative class, and simultaneously the investment in public safety that was being made by the city that allowed people to think about moving into neighborhoods that previously they never would have thought of moving into because they weren't safe. And what you've seen, I think, in a borough like Brooklyn is exactly what you're describing, which is it was first the artists who moved to neighborhoods like Williamsburg, like Greenpoint, now Bushwick and neighborhoods beyond that, and took what had been industrial neighborhoods that had suffered long-term decline, moved into those spaces, renovated those spaces, created communities, and then have attracted other young people and the larger creative class. You know, we're today at a point, I was reading an article in the New York Times not long ago that was saying that in Paris, the phrase for something being contemporary and cool and urban is très Brooklyn. And I think that Brooklyn is exactly the kind of place and the moment in time that Brooklyn is experiencing is exactly the benefit that a place can experience as a result of the influx of the arts, the influx of the creative class.
I mean, I agree with you. I mean, Brooklyn is great, but there is a difference if you let someone into your living room or if you put them into the maid's chamber.
But
and Brooklyn is sort of, you know, there's a difference if there's space really in the core of your city
but
for
what's
artists
amazing,
to create something, or whether it's going to the outskirts. I mean,
but what
there
is
is a
amazing,
migration already towards, you know,
but
towards
what's amazing, though, about these neighborhoods in Brooklyn is that they have become the core. I mean, if you look at what's happened along the Brooklyn waterfront, it was first the artists who came, but now some of the fastest growing commercial centers in the city are in Brooklyn, not in Manhattan. The neighborhoods like Dumbo, that's home to major corporations like Etsy, that are taking advantage of and creating business models around the creative people who moved into these neighborhoods first, coming as artists, coming as creators, and now it's becoming a business hub. It's becoming, these are some of the most desirable neighborhoods now that surround these areas in the entirety of New York City. And so I agree with you that there is a difference between the living room and the maid's room. But as we know from New York real estate, sometimes the maid's room becomes the living room. And
I mean, I think, again, I agree with you, but again, I want to disagree. I mean, I think it is interesting exactly what you described with Dumbo, because I think Dumbo is exactly the misunderstanding of this kind of development, that artists come and make something sort of sexy and then the business can sort of move in. I don't know any good artist that lives in Dumbo. You know, there is sort of this, and we had our
No good artists live in Dumbo.
That is so subjective.
We had our office when I was working in New York. We moved our office to Dumbo for some time, so I know very well the vibe of Dumbo. And it seems, and it is something that is very artificial and that is very manufactured. And I think because it was exactly, the Valentises, and that's what they had in mind. They thought, we're going to attract some great cultural institutions, and then our real estate is going to have so much more value. They put St. Anne's warehouse there. After 5 years, they're going to throw them out and put them somewhere else because the space...
Also in Dumbo.
In Dumbo, I know, but I think that's exactly sort of the wrong understanding of how the arts can have a positive impact on building a city, because they're just used as a tool to create something. And
Ilse,
I think
if I
you
may
have to let the artists...
Put an order list, because if they don't stop, we'll never jump in. I'm being too polite.
I think this is quite fun, actually.
Sure. Only to say that, I have to say, because I'm not picking sides, I think they're both right. There is a study done, I just want to tell you a little story of 66 variables that were used to compare cities, worldwide cities, world-class cities, of which Toronto is in the top 5, by the way. New York is number 1. And that was a study that PwC did, and they've done every year. And I hope everyone will go grab it. If you can't get it off the PwC website, just call me, because I'll get it for you. And what it speaks to is exactly this dialogue of what are the variables, and more importantly, what's the correlation between the variables? And when you pick one, it's amazing how consistently and across the board of the 26 top world cities that were studied, how when you affect this one goes up. When you pick this one goes up. And why that's important to city leadership is it will help you pick which variables in what order of priority to decide your resourcing. So that if you're going to pick security because the politicos are saying that's my issue today, fortunately, these are the additional variables that will automatically go up on that scale. And it helps leadership determine that. And what I'm mindful of is that constantly in city leadership, there's the difference between what the bureaucrats know to be true by the facts that they have to live with and that they have to prove to their political masters. And their political masters who are pulled and pushed by a whole different set of circumstances every day. And if the leadership that have to work with the facts every day don't understand how to put it in front of their political masters in a way that will be palatable to them to meet their masters, it'll always fail. And so there's this constant push and pull, but I actually believe it's doable and possible. So when we talk about where you make your investments, if you don't, as leadership in your city, also come with the plan for a severe rethink on how we fund our city services, using third-party, new financial models, all of the things that fortunately, in my new world outside of politics now, PwC does do that for cities. They're doing that with the city of Toronto, in fact, and some spectacular, great things that are happening here, that how to finance. How do you bring your political master the answer, which is the one that will have their eyes glaze over if you don't tell them the how, make that part of the pitch. And that's why I know there are solutions for this. Only to say, this Cities of Opportunity is what the report is called, and it's a fascination because as I sit listening to these two gurus on the stage, and Gordon and I sitting so quietly, which is so unusual for the two of us to sit quietly anywhere.
I'm a very quiet man.
It's amazing because it is actually represented, in fact, not just the anecdotes that they're bringing today. It's quite factual, and it's happened in every one of the 26 cities as a part of this study every year.
Can I just say my little unquiet thing? I actually think what we had was two people that had complete agreement on what they wanted to try and accomplish and a disagreement about how we were accomplishing it. And I think one of the things we have to do to change is we have to start to focus in on areas that we have agreement on. So I'm very interested to hear that one of the critical components is space. What we mean by that is inexpensive space, or space that people can live in and work in, and all those sorts of things. So if we really want to have that dynamic, artistic city, one of the groups that I go to find out from how do you get that is the artistic community, and say, how do we need that? What do we do with that? How does that fit in then to what the other things that we might be talking about, or the things that you're chatting about? Because if we don't get to what we're actually agreeing on, if we could focus on agreement, we would run out of resources before we ran out of agreement. We spend a lot of time focusing our effort, our energy on what we disagree on. So that's why it's so important to sort of, in our own minds, define what our vision of an innovative city is. I actually don't think you can have an innovative city, I think we'd all agree with this, if you don't have a vibrant cultural community in it. They may be different. Every community can't be the top world-class city in the world and this, that, and the next thing. There's only one first, You know, there's a whole bunch of seconds, thirds, and fourths maybe, but we have to be willing to sort of focus on what we agree on. So that would be something we agree on. If you really care about that, maybe we have to start thinking about how we find that space and where we find that space. If you really want mixed neighborhoods, maybe we have to think about how do you really get mixed neighborhoods. You have to have neighborhoods that are as welcoming to people on low income as they are to people on high income. We label a lot of solutions out of the conversation by labeling them. Say, well, that must be bad, so we won't even talk about that anymore. So I do think that's a big, big issue for us to try and deal with. And you know, this kind of a dialogue, I think, helps us understand what we're trying to accomplish.
And where the alignments are.
And where you find alignment, where you find mutual commitment.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with you. Everything, all the issues we deal with in the world today are going to happen because of partnerships, because people are working together to accomplish them as opposed to separately. And that's why sometimes large events bring people together, because they create that vision for people that they can find new ways of doing things, because it feels one-off. And then one of the real benefits is the long-term changes in how you deal with one another, because you've done something in partnership that's been a success.
So sticking with that large-scale events, I don't think any of us can resist, High Commissioner, asking you, 1 week away from the Summer Olympics in London, you lived through the Winter Olympics in Vancouver and saw the extraordinary impact of that on the city of Vancouver and certainly on our national psyche. How is the London event different, and how do you see London actually capitalize on that opportunity of this extraordinary global gathering at a scale that is really quite difficult to comprehend?
Yeah, the first thing I think it's really critical for people to know is that the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics are totally different kinds of events. Just to give you 3 quick little metrics. In the Winter Olympic, there were 2,700 coaches and athletes. In the Summer Olympics, there's 15,000. In the Winter Olympics, there were 10,000 media representatives. In the Summer Olympics, there's 20,000. And this is my favorite. In the Winter Olympics, there were 12 heads of state that visited us. In London, there'll be 120 plus heads of state. So it is a completely different scale. They're going to do a Summer Olympics in Rio. I'll give you another example. The Beijing Summer Olympics, what the budget is that we were told about was $44 billion. Rio has said that their Summer Olympics is going to be a decade-long development proposal for all of Brazil. That's what the president said when they got it. So there's completely different scales of activities. But I think both, we had some goals in Vancouver, which I think we accomplished it. I used to say we want the world to get to know Vancouver, but we'd like Canada to get to know Vancouver a little bit too. So we wanted it to be Canada's Games. I think we were relatively successful in that. We exceeded metrics because it was a partnership, federal, provincial, local, volunteer, people, private sector, all people coming together, and it was, I think, a big success. London's Olympics is quite a bit different. Obviously it's more expensive, it's summer. They're using the Summer Olympics to revitalize and, they hope, create a whole new sort of sense of neighborhood and community and new environmental design in East London, in the neighborhood of East London. So they have a lot of additional things. Plus, I think, they would like the world to think of the United Kingdom as a 21st century country, not as, what do you think about Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth the First? So I think that they have a different vision for it, but I believe that with all of the talk that's going on now, they'll have a very successful Olympics. I think people in the United Kingdom will embrace it, and it will help launch London. But the Olympics, those events, whether it's an expo in Vancouver, an Olympics in Vancouver, which I experienced, those things are only good if you follow them through, if you carry them on, if you learn from them, and you make them sort of the launching pad for what you're doing as opposed to the landing pad of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm going to open it for questions. We have roving mics. Just put up your hand. Any questions? There we go.
Good morning. Is it modesty by the panel that hasn't covered inspired leadership? Because we have Mayor Bloomberg, we've had Minister Pupatello, we have Mayor Campbell, and we have Jorn, who've actually all made a difference because of their own personalities. You heard in the introduction on Rio, nothing really happened until the mayor made a decision. So basically, how important do you think for a community, a city, a country, leadership actually is?
I think it's critically important. I also agree with you. I was a great mayor of Vancouver.
I don't know.
think,
You went
seriously-
from your worship to your excellency. You did all right, actually. Yeah.
The excellency thing doesn't work very well for me. I actually do seriously think this. I think one of the most important things we have to have today is people that are committed to doing what they want to do, not what they want to be. So if you know what you want to do, it's amazing how you can become, you can bring people behind you to actually accomplish it. That's what actually, you become a sort of the glue that holds the community together in driving for a particular thing. So I do think leadership is important, and we're going through an interesting time because leadership has a lot more buffers against it now than it used to. We had a presentation from the gentleman from IBM, and he talked about all the knowledge we have. We have a whole bunch of information. There's no question. There is a ton of information compared to what we're used to. We also have a whole bunch of misinformation. And I would argue that misinformation is growing at a more rapid extent than information is growing. So how do we actually deal with that and break through that? It goes back to what I believe, at least, is a vision of what you want to be and where you want to go. I'll use an example. Have any of you heard of Yaletown in Vancouver? So Yaletown sat there for a long time. And people that cared about cities said, what you have to do is you have to create a place that people live, et cetera, et cetera. It was a commercial industrial zone. It had what we call in Vancouver a floor space ratio of about 5, and it sat there. And people said, wouldn't it be great if we did this? And it sat there. And nothing was happening, and it sat there. So when I was in council, we said, we're going to rezone it. We're going to rezone it residential. There were 2 reasons we were doing it. One was because we thought we had to give people the opportunity to walk to work. The business community was against it. Lots of people said we shouldn't do it. The planners weren't sure we should do it. We said, we went to a public hearing, and we did it. Today, it is a significant success. It helps populate Vancouver. It helps change the way the streets work. It's been it's integrated the whole city around the downtown. It worked, but it only worked because we said, well, we're going to do it, and let's see. I'll give you one little quick stat. We said we had to give people the choice of whether they'd walk to work or not. People will never walk to work. Today in downtown Vancouver, more than 50% of the trips are walking because we gave people the choice of whether they wanted to walk to work or not. If you don't give them the choice, they're not going to walk to work. So I do think leadership makes a difference, but leadership is what do you want to be and what do you want to do? What is important to do? And if you get what's important to do and bring people behind it, I think you can accomplish some things.
Well, and I agree with that. I think that there are really 2 obstacles today to effective leadership that have paralyzed a lot of people, which is, one, the amount of information. Just sifting through information, sifting through the noise, being able to ignore the constant barrage of negative comments that will come your way if you make a decision. And the second thing is the pernicious influence of money, frankly, in politics, and the fact that so many leaders are so beholden to so many people. And I think the leader who is able to cut through, and this may be more true in the United States than in Canada, I'm not sure, but I think that the leader who is able to, not surprising to hear, the leader who's able to cut through those obstacles and to really put forth a vision, to make a decision, to be able to deal with negative repercussions and people who criticize and say that I've listened, and making a good decision is not making a snap decision, it's making an informed decision. I've listened to people, I've balanced the different considerations, I've come up with what I think is the right path forward, and now I'm going to move on it and I'm going to execute it. That is the effective leader, and it's very difficult, I think, in this environment to find people who are able to do that.
And there's no question, certainly from the outside, that the leadership in New York is very palpable around that notion. York?
Well, no, I fully agree with you, Seth. I did want to.
So good we brought you 2 together. It's great.
No, but I think it is a very, very interesting point, and I think it is a very scary point that you're making and others are making here. Is it still possible for great leadership today? Yes. I mean, how can we make that possible? And I had a great conversation with a great Canadian author in a couple of weeks ago, where he was talking about the decline of the political system also in Canada, and he linked it very much also to the disappearance of humor in Canadian politics, which was quite new to me, that it had this really integral quality to Canadian politics, and that it was important for politicians to be humorous and funny. And that this is not existent anymore, and I suspect it is exactly for these reasons that you do that a lot of opinions then come against you and all of that you just can't expose yourself like that anymore. But how can we make great leadership still possible? I mean, it really is a huge question, I think. Luckily, I think, in the arts, again, it is a little bit of a different thing, because as artists can basically create their own universe. They can create their own complete world, and they can do things that I think that also rouse controversy that others wouldn't be able to do.
So
But
let
I
me
think-
let me
I
be
don't
pro-
think
So
this
artists
is new.
should be leaders.
So we're
No,
over
Seth.
there at my far, my right over there is David Crombie. David Crombie was a leader of the city of Toronto. He actually made people think that Toronto was a good place to be. It was a place that you could live in, you could enjoy, you could, that was a big switch then. We forget it was a big switch because it was a long time ago now. But it used to be cities were places that we lived in and we left. What do we need cultural stuff for? We're just going to work in a city and leave it, right? We need it because we want these to be places that people live their lives, their whole lives. David Crombie was a leader in that in Toronto. He was a leader of that in Canada. Art Phillips was a leader of that in Canada, in Vancouver. It was a big shift for people to think that actually we don't need a freeway to give us the escape route out of the city as fast as we can get out of the city. And I think that those are big fundamental changes that have happened, and we have to sort of build that next generation. No leader comes and sort of walks in. So my theory, this is just a theory, you have to be willing to lose for something if you're going to be a leader. You have to think something is important enough to lose if you're going to lead it. If you lose, that's okay, because losing is what's supposed to be happening in an open democracy. You're supposed to be able to actually let people make real choices, not these sort of soft, who we're all the same kind of choices, but real choices. And I do think that in cities, what kind of city do we want? Have you ever heard a mayor? Has anyone here ever heard a mayor anywhere in Canada, probably even in the United States, say, you know what I want to be? I want to be the mayor of the most sprawling community in the world. If I could just get a little more sprawl here, I'm going to feel very good about myself. No one says that. And yet we do that. We haven't actually demanded that we bring these things together and say, what do you mean by the city that you're talking about? What will you do with the city that you're talking about? And I think if we can have that kind of discussion, we'll have different cities, which is a good thing, with different responses to challenges, which is a good thing, and we'll learn something. And as we learn, we'll carry on.
Yeah, I have to say, I met a lot of mayors in 16 years of public office, and one thing I have to say, Adam Vaughan is here, and he's very funny. So I just want to say that right now. You're a funny guy. Anyway, yeah, and I do think you can't keep humor. There's one funny guy. Only to say, you see what you started when you asked that one question. But what I noticed about all the mayors I met, whether it was the mayor of Milano or London, England, UK, New York, it's the incremental trust the public continued to gain, so that when they really needed it, they could make the big decision. So they were not the fly-by-night new guy with a big idea. It was the incremental, said I would do this, this is what I did, what'd you think? Then to the next step, then to the next step. So that, and I'm not saying don't have the guy with the big idea or the woman with this fabulous new thing she's gonna bring. It's that it needs to be done in an incremental fashion to acknowledge that you have in every city multi-generations. So what cities have to do today is figure out how to keep your 20-year-olds in the city for life and put their kids in your schools when they're 40, et cetera, which is a very different conversation of service delivery than your 80-year-olds who are a lot more mobile these days than they used to be. Very different conversation. So the incrementalness of being a good leader and delivering and being honest and taking your drubbings when you deserve them. So when you have to have the big decisions and tough choices to make, they're going to back you, because in the main, for a long time you've been trustworthy. And I think for a number of reasons, media generally, social media, the new media, all those things have caused us to be very today as opposed to over a period of time. But just as clever as the media is, just compounds the pressure on politicians to be equally clever in their use of it to their advantage, which I think many people do very well. And only to say those mayors I've met, men and women, literally around the world, have managed to have this trust level built up. Well, you know what, in the end the public will say, well, I don't like this, but if so-and-so's doing this, it must be okay. I don't know, Bloomberg, he can't even stand up in those new apartments in Toronto, in New York they want to build, but if he says we should build cubicles for apartments, let's just do it. You know, because he's established himself by the time he does something that seems a bit edgy by the 80-year-olds, you know?
And just to build on that, I completely agree with you that you need to build confidence in the public by proving that you can keep the trains running on time, that you can make the incremental investments. But I also think the second part of what you said is really critical, which is that you also do have to have the big vision to be a great leader, because our world is moving in quantum steps. And if all that we ever do is make incremental investments, we're going to be left behind. And you know, and to your point, I think that to be successful at making the quantum steps, you also have to be willing to lose every so often, and to be comfortable with that because you think that the direction that you're proposing for your city is the right direction.
Well, let me just be provocative for our two political leaders. I mean, I think this is all, you know, all very, very, sounds very nice. But the challenge we have in Canada is that even as we've migrated from a world of nations and a country of provinces to a world of cities now, our way of funding our country is inverse to that. How are we actually going to get the political will to really invest in our cities, to position them as those drivers of Canada's overall success, given that we've set up this food chain of begging for cities to provinces to the federal government, and that all of those processes get buffeted by not necessarily either visionary collective aligned views, but very much changes in the immediate time.
I don't want to jump in front of His Excellency. I feel like you gave me the perfect opportunity for a commercial. I can't miss it. But when I said earlier about, just briefly, about make the really hard choices of you know, how you're going to share your resources, because you need money to do these great things. So on all the mundane tasks of a city, that you got to go register, you know, your all the offices, your whatever title, do that in a very efficient fashion. Take some bold steps to do that in a whole new way. And there are people, read like PwC, that go in and say, God, you can do this so much better, so much cheaper. Outsourcing, third party, all those things that heretofore were sacred cows. Oh my God, we can't talk about them. But when you put them in the context that you will be able to be so efficient on these mundane things that are absolutely the public's expectation, here's what you're going to do with this. And you're going to do these great new things that you absolutely do not have the money for, but you will find a way with new methods of financing. And unfortunately, we have had some really bad examples when cities tried to be creative in this area and suffered a mighty consequence, for sure. Fortunately, that was so long ago already that people are ready to go back and try again. So there are groups out there that actually help communities, cities, provinces, you name it, to do all the mundane stuff in an altogether different fashion, so that you can turn your resources finally to, you know, the development of your technology backbone, the using of cloud technology. I was telling a story before we started in the back room when I was sitting there in, I don't know, a UK cafe or something, and some guy walked by the car meter to pay for his car, and he sort of beeped it with his handheld device, his smartphone. And my first reaction was, oh God, we should be doing that in Toronto, you know. But what that little picture, that little vignette of some guy to pay his parking, did it with his smartphone, and I'm saying like 4 years ago, it's not like yesterday. What does that mean in terms of back office requirements for the city to be able to do that?
But Sandra, you're still a politician. You've completely evaded my question. So let's see if I can get Gordon.
I haven't. I could only
PwC
say,
is not going to mobilize the political will to drive
no, but the
massive
whole
investment
point is
in our cities.
when you put it in the context of what you can give your citizenry when you make these tough choices, the politicians need to say why. If they can't answer why and believe it, they'll never sell it. And so that they need to know that this is why. If in fact you need more revenue, why? This is what I'm doing with the revenue. Do people believe in the this is what I'm doing with the revenue? If they know this is why, they're going to accept how you have to do it, and they may actually choose to do it in an altogether different fashion than they might have even 10 years ago. And there are examples of that. In the city of Milano, on those street corners with all of the data that the guru literally that was on this morning showed that multitude of data available to cities today, it is absolutely true that in every single city we have way too much data and we don't even use it. That if we do one thing, and that is start using the data we actually collect with proper analysis to drive decision making, we're already 100 feet ahead of where we were a moment ago. And in Milano, they knew every intersection where all the pedestrians kept getting hit. And it became a huge political issue for the leadership of Milano, like pedestrian accidents all the time. So they put up cameras on all the hot spots. They used the data, and they put up cameras, and within weeks, all of the numbers fell flat. The political headache disappeared. And not only that, they realized, oh my God, with these cameras, we have like all this other information now. Look at all these other great things we could do. And it was a great little story about using data, making it effective, the fact that they brought in security, seen as more safe for a whole bunch of reasons. People will walk, which they want them to do because there's too many cars, and on the story goes. The same story as in every big city.
Hi, Commissioner. Deep in thought.
I'm thinking, yeah. It was accidental.
You are funny.
So I want to go back to what I was saying before, first of all, and that is, if cities think that the answer to city problems is just send more money, so everyone should get this, there's only one taxpayer. There's the provincial taxpayer, the federal taxpayer, the provincial, local taxpayer, the regional taxpayer. It's all the same pocketbook. So it is a matter of us saying, what do we want to accomplish and how do we do it? And so I can tell you, as someone who was elected, if you're elected in this, you're the mayor of the city, the community-centered board comes and says, all we need is more money, we don't have any problems. If you're elected to the premier of the province, the cities regularly come and say, all we need is more money, we don't have any problems. I'm sure if you're elected to prime minister, the provinces come and say, if we just gave more money, we wouldn't have any problems. That is not the answer. More thinking is the first answer, and understanding what we want to do. And I just want to tell you this quick, go back to this, because I do think it's important as a message. In Vancouver, and I was the mayor of Vancouver, that's the city I know, so I'm sorry I'm coming back to these examples all the time. The North Shore of False Creek, which you call Concord Pacific maybe, or the Expo lands, was an dying industrial area in the late 1960s. They said, let's make it into an urban neighborhood. Nothing happened. By 1986, just a mere 18 years later, the premier of the province of the day said, well, we'd like to look at putting BC Place Stadium there, and maybe we should do urban redevelopment. Nothing happened. The key was this. When I was elected in '86 with the council, we said, you can't keep having people come and saying, is this right? Is this what you want? Is this what you want? The first job is to say, what do you want? So we went with what we called 16 guiding principles across that 207 acres and said to the private sector, if you're willing to meet those guiding principles, come and talk to us about what you'd like to do. So we then had our planners working with the private sector as they came forward on this particular chunk of property. They came up with those 16 guiding principles. We actually passed it. This is important. It wasn't political. It was almost unanimous on city council, which was not a typical thing in Vancouver. And it worked, and we got the North Shore of False Creek. Now, whether people like it or not is kind of beside the point in terms of we actually got something to happen as opposed to not happen. We then did exactly the same thing on the Burrard Inlet waterfront. Burrard Inlet is as you look across towards the North Shore Mountains. Again, it had been a rail yard. We couldn't figure out what we were going to do with it. We went from 1974 to the early 1990s before we finally said, this is what we want, and then people started to do it. Same with Yaletown. So you have to know where you're going. And then You use the other tools to help you get to where you want to go. And I do think that that's really an important part of what you have to do as you develop a vision. You have to know what it is you're actually trying to accomplish, and then you have to say, are we in alignment with that? So regulations, I totally agree with Seth on regulation. We have all kinds of regulations. We've sort of got phyllo-pastry regulation going all through of our lives, you know, sort of very thin layers of regulation that don't really have anything particularly of substance, but when you put them all together, they become opaque. You know, what is it that we're really trying to accomplish? What are the real results we do? And if you want to be an innovative city, the first group to be innovative in a city, it's not going to be the private sector. They're innovating all the time. It's governments. It's what can you do differently in government to actually accomplish the goals that you're setting for yourself, which somehow or other we keep on not accomplishing. So I think in terms of the dollars and cents, I think, yes, you know, I haven't met a Canadian taxpayer yet. I'm sure you haven't met one in the United States yet that says, I'm just paying too little tax. I'd like to give you more. So the question is, how do we allocate those resources? And there have been steps in that regard. The federal government had a major urban infrastructure program. In British Columbia, we said it's not coming through the province, just go straight to the municipalities, let them decide what they're doing with it. Now that's unusual because of Canada. We end up talking about the Constitution and all sorts of different things. What we said was, it's your money, we'll put it right through the local governments to do it. And interesting, the local governments then start saying, boy, this is tough to allocate these resources. Are they going to small communities or large communities? Is there someone that's going to be special, or is there someone that's not going to be special? I'll bet you in Ontario, people outside in Ontario say, all the money goes to Toronto. Does anyone ever hear that in Ontario? In Quebec, they probably hear it always goes to Montreal. In Alberta, they probably hear it always goes to Calgary. In the United Kingdom, it always goes evidently to London. In British Columbia, it always goes to Vancouver. I bet in New York State, they think it all goes to New York City. You know, so we do have to figure out how we balance those things out. But you have to start by understanding it's all the same guy that's paying the same person that's paying the tax bill. And then you go to them and you say, look, we could do better for you with your dollars if we did it this way. But someone's going to have to be willing to say, that's what I'm going to do. And there'll be a lot of people that tell you that's not what you should do.
I think in the United States, we have three sets of challenges. One is that we actually do underinvest in our infrastructure, and we're underinvesting in our cities. The statistic that I've read is that in the United States, we put something like 3% of our GDP into infrastructure. The equivalent figure in Europe is something like 6%, and the equivalent figure in China is something like 9%. Now, they're not exactly apples to apples because we have an in-place infrastructure in China. They're building anew. But that really actually, in my opinion, only states half the problem. Because it's not just that we're not investing enough, it's that we're not getting enough unit of infrastructure for the dollar that we're investing. And this comes back to the point that several people were making, which is that we're really inefficient in spending our money. And that's because of regulations, that's because of decisions that we make consciously and unconsciously. If you look at what we're able to get for the dollars that we spend, there are so many things that we could do to make our spending more efficient, where even if we didn't put another dollar into the pot, we could get much more out for the money that we're spending. But then the third problem that we face is that I think that we only look to one source, which is the taxpayers, and that there are other ways of leveraging investment to be able to do some of the things that we need to do, even in times where governments are fiscally strapped. And the one example I'll just very quickly give from New York is that we spoke to the private sector, and what we heard from the private sector was that if you look at great centers of innovation around the world, what you see is that at their core there's a certain critical mass of engineering and applied sciences research and development. And if you look at New York, even though we have great universities in the city, relative to the size of our economy, we have a gross metropolitan product that's roughly the size of the economy of India. We just don't have enough. And so we said, well, how can we get more of that here? We can't afford, and we're not experts at building universities, building R&D facilities, but maybe we can partner with people who are. And so we put out a challenge, and we took about $100 million in city money, and we had a worldwide competition where we asked universities from around the world, if we gave you land, if we gave you that $100 million, would you be willing to make a significant investment here? And the response that we got was overwhelming, and at the end of this whole process, we ended up with a partnership with Cornell and the Technion, which is a major engineering school in Israel. They're going to be investing $2 billion to our $100 million, building a 2 million square foot brand new engineering school that's going to nearly double the number of full-time graduate engineering students in New York City. We are investing. We made a decision to use taxpayer monies and put that into it, but we're getting so much more for that money than just the dollars that we're putting in. And so if the United States, and I imagine there are similar challenges in Canada, wants to close that gap with places like China, where the 3% versus the 9%, part of it is squeezing more money, more unit of infrastructure out of that dollar that we're putting in, but part of it is also finding other people to put that money in and match our money and leverage that multiple times over.
Yeah, new partnerships and funding. Let's have one more question from the audience.
For cities in North America, what are the opportunities and challenges that are emerging from the European financial crisis to catalyze innovation here or attract talent or build relationships that bring talent to North American cities?
I think that we do look for an opportunity when people say that, and I hate to say that we would be poaching from the U.S. I don't think we've ever done that, actually. Anyway, when the Americans decided to really tighten up their immigration policies, Toronto largely was the single beneficiary of that American policy. And we ended up in Canadian schools nationwide with students who would not have come to Canada as their first choice, but came because the Americans said no. And we ultimately got the most fantastic people to come to our country and have put roots down here since. People who, might have taken a little longer to discover our country, but for a city like Toronto, very multicultural, the ability to have a Mars facility here, the hospital mile within a stone's throw, right here, is a huge attractor. And then taking advantage of when people put their head up and look around and see a welcoming opportunity because they need to feel the love, and they come to a place like Toronto that's given the love, you're going to get huge benefits from what is a temporary difficulty in another region. And our best nearest example is the Americans on immigration policy, let alone the financial.
I wonder, though, is Canada's immigration policy really, aggressive is maybe the wrong word, but I mean, in a positive way, enough?
It's not.
Because,
No,
I mean,
it's
it was,
not.
you talking about the European crisis, I read an article in a German newspaper, and I'm German, so I still do read German newspapers, that last year in Germany, they had 950,000 people come to live and work in Germany. That's 1 million people of a population of 80 million, but still, it's 1 million people. 250,000 immigrants came to Canada. Germany is not even an immigration country, but what that means, that workforce coming to Germany, and of course it is a lot of Europeans, Greeks and Spaniards and people who can just go to Germany because they have the European passport and can work there. But that's a huge asset, and shouldn't Canada try to attract more of these people into its country? I mean, there was this great, I thought, great sort of series of articles in the Globe and Mail about Canada as an immigration country, and this hypothesis that Canada should really have 100 million, the goal should be 100 million in population, which I think really makes sense because it would create a greater density, and a greater density across the country creates also better infrastructure and also more opportunities. Again, coming back to the arts, because there is not enough, the density of institutions within Canada is not enough, I think, to support a great cultural scene. And Canada is so huge and so diverse that people who live in Vancouver don't know what's going on in Toronto, don't know what's going on in Montreal, and there is no communication so much.
I was going to use my sense
arts.
of humor there for a second.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I totally agree with you on Canada. Number one, Canada is a relatively, we have to remember, Canada's smaller than California. We're just bigger geographically, but in terms of our population, we're smaller. Having said that, I actually think Canada has a pretty aggressive immigration policy at 250,000 people. There's people coming from all over the world. It's an open immigration policy, which is, I think, equally important to what the sort of the nature of the country is, become a welcoming country where we actually welcome strangers. We don't say keep back. That doesn't mean there's not stresses that are created by that. I do think the European situation right now, though, is we're all going through change. There's some obvious stuff in Europe that's happening that's obviously causing everyone, I think, a great deal of concern. But when you look at the opportunities that are created by the comprehensive trade agreement that's coming with Europe, it's going to allow for the free flow of people. When you talk about the people moving to Germany, that's one of the things the European Union does. It allows people to move through the European Union with relative ease compared to what we have. We have this ocean between us, which makes it a little more difficult. But I do think that it is a huge opportunity for us because we actually have very long-term and very deep roots in Western Europe particularly. And that goes back, I think, to cultural activities, to the strength of us culturally, to the strength of the people that we have that are living together, and we can be welcoming to them. So I think there's big opportunities as we expand our trade markets in Europe. The natural resources we have here can be used there. I'll tell you one quick story, it doesn't have to do with Europe. The governor of Guangdong province is visiting us. Guangdong province in China is in the southwestern part of China. It's a sister province with British Columbia. So he's sitting there with me, and I say to him at one point, I said, Governor, what's the population of Guangdong province? And he says, oh, it's officially it's about 90 million, but unofficially we think it's 110. I said, oh, that's great. He says, and what's the population of British Columbia? I said, well, officially it's 4.1 million, and it might be 4.2. At that point, I lifted him up off the floor and put him back on his chair. And what he said to me was, we've got lots of people and not very much in natural resources. You've got lots of natural resources, but not very much in people, so there's opportunities there. If we're talking about innovation, if we're talking about alternative energies or energy generally, if we're talking about natural resources, if we're talking about educational connections, which are huge benefits to Canada, there are enormous opportunities between Western Europe and Canada, particularly the EU and Canada, particularly as we move towards what at least I think is hoped will be the conclusion of the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. That will create the same kind of boost to our economy and excitement in the economy, I think, that we've had from the past. And there will be many different cultures that would come as part of that. Europe is not a uniculture. It's many different cultures that will come and be part of that. And that will, I think, invigorate Canada, invigorate our cities, and invigorate our economy.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think you will all agree that we've benefited from enormous expertise and generosity from our panelists. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking them.